In this video, I'll reveal the key differences between the real story and the film Ford v. Ferrari. You'll learn how the brilliant manager Lee Iacocca was unfairly portrayed as a fool, how NASA specialists played a role in the creation of the GT40, and how racer Ken Miles was robbed of his rightful victory, while the crowd watched in silent approval. The movie sets up its story by showing Ford struggling financially, blaming the head of advertising, Lee Iacocca, whose marketing strategies supposedly hadn't delivered results for years. But in reality, the situation was quite different.
In the last 3 years, you and your marketing team have presided over the worst sales slump in U.S. history.
Ford's financial troubles actually began after the failed launch of the Edsel, a new car model that turned out to be a disaster. It was Lee Iacocca who truly led Ford out of its financial struggles. He introduced a revolutionary credit system for car purchases, which sent sales skyrocketing. However, in the film, Iacocca is, to put it mildly, not shown in the best light. His projector malfunctions, he mutters under his breath, and he constantly scrambles to make excuses, whether to Enzo Ferrari or Henry Ford II. Anyone unfamiliar with his real-life accomplishments might assume he was just a clueless second-rate manager whom no one took seriously. But in reality, Lee Iacocca was one of the most brilliant and effective executives in the history of the auto industry. His influence grew so immense that 12 years after the film's events, Henry Ford II fired him out of sheer jealousy, frustrated that the company's board of directors was starting to respect Iacocca more than Ford himself. After being forced out, Iacocca didn't just fade away. Iacocca moved to the struggling Chrysler Corporation. Under his leadership, Chrysler rose from the ashes like a phoenix, eventually outperforming Ford in every key metric. It was yet another demonstration of Iacocca's genius and proof that Henry Ford II paled in comparison to his legendary grandfather. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back to the film. In the end, the only thing the movie got right about Lee Iacocca was that he was the one who proposed using motorsports victories to boost Ford's sales. There was just one problem. Ford didn't have a sports car. That's when the idea of buying Ferrari emerged. At the time, Ferrari was primarily a racing car manufacturer. Enzo Ferrari was truly obsessed with motorsport, and for him, everything revolved around racing. The company's entire commercial activity existed solely to fund its motorsport ambitions. By focusing all of its resources, attention, and manpower on racing, Ferrari dominated the most prestigious competitions year after year. But this relentless pursuit of victory pushed the company to the brink of financial collapse. With Ferrari on the verge of bankruptcy, Ford saw an opportunity. The company sent an entire delegation to Italy to evaluate Ferrari and proceed with a potential acquisition. In the film, for some reason, this delegation is led by Lee Iacocca, who ultimately just stands there, eyes downcast, listening to Enzo Ferrari's scathing speech. In reality, however, everyone had their own role. The head of the Ford evaluation team was Roy Lunn, the company's chief engineer, while the negotiations were handled by Donald Frey, Iacocca's top deputy, which, logically, makes a lot more sense. Lee Iacocca was a marketing expert. His job was to define Ford's strategic direction, not to assess Ferrari's technical capabilities. He wisely left that task to the engineers, believing quite rightly that everyone should focus on what they do best. In the film, it's a bit unclear why Enzo Ferrari ultimately rejected Ford's merger offer.
If I wish to race Le Mans and you do not wish for me to race Le Mans, do we or do we not go?
You do not go.
In quel caso, se non dovessi...
Grazie, ho capito.
Ford's main goal in buying Ferrari was to win the 24 hours of Le Mans, which makes the situation portrayed in the movie even theoretically impossible. So, what was Enzo Ferrari's real issue with the deal? Of course, Enzo had no doubts about competing in Le Mans. That was never the problem. The real sticking point was a harsh clause in the contract requiring him to get Ford's approval for any expenses over $250,000 per year. As I've mentioned before, Enzo was a fanatic about racing, and for him, everything he did commercially was focused on raising money to fund his racing team. In other words, he saw the merger with Ford as a way to free himself from the constant struggle to raise money. But what he ended up with was a new headache. Instead of worrying about funding, he'd have to beg Ford executives for every penny of his budget. Over time, the real reasons for the breakdown of negotiations became blurred. As is often the case, people started to speculate that Ferrari never truly intended to sell to Ford, and that the entire affair was a strategy to raise Ferrari's value before selling it to Fiat. However, the failed negotiations took place in 1963, and in reality, Ferrari was bought by Fiat 6 years later in 1969, after the events of the film. Enzo was finally granted full control over the racing team for life by Fiat, without any of the troublesome clauses about having to beg for money. Nevertheless, Henry Ford II had valid reasons for his deep resentment toward Enzo Ferrari. First, the audit of Ferrari ended up costing $1 million, and ultimately, that money was just thrown away. Second, as depicted in the film, the passionate Enzo, using Italian profanity, described Ford and his ugly cars coming out of the ugly factory. He even went so far as to vividly criticize Henry Ford II, claiming that he was utterly incompetent compared to his legendary grandfather. Ford was furious and set a simple goal: develop and build a car that would steal the Le Mans victory from Ferrari the very next year. Anyone with even a basic understanding of racing car development knew that such a task was nearly impossible. However, buying an already tested car and refining it seemed like a much more achievable goal. The film skips over the early development of the iconic GT40. Carroll Shelby briefly mentions that initial designs were created in England.
Fresh off the plane from England.
This was done for pacing, to keep the audience engaged, and to avoid distracting from the main story about Shelby and Ken Miles. However, this approach might lead viewers to believe that the creation of the GT40 was entirely due to these two men. In reality, enormous resources were allocated for the project, and an incredible number of people were involved. The Lola MK6 served as the prototype for the GT40. This car had already competed in Le Mans and was designed by the company Lola, led by Eric Broadley. Though it didn't gain much fame, the Lola MK6 couldn't even finish the 1963 Le Mans race, breaking down at the 15th hour. This gave the mechanics some relief, as the car had spent 2 out of the 15 hours in the repair pits. It might seem like the Lola MK6 had little chance of securing a place in history with its performances. However, Ford's management decided to purchase the MK6 for further development, as they had a massive budget and very little time to explore other options. For the 1964 season, Ford's chief engineer, Roy Lunn, was sent to London to work on the car's modifications. He was the same engineer who had traveled to Italy to assess Ferrari. If anyone in the film deserved to be portrayed in a bad light, it was Roy Lunn. Despite the unlimited budget provided by Ford, the 1964 season, under his leadership, was an absolute disaster. The 1964 season is completely omitted from the movie. In the film, Shelby and his team are only shown getting involved with the car's development in 1965, after the Mustang was launched. Interestingly, in reality, the creation of the Mustang is entirely credited to Lee Iacocca and his team, who once again helped Ford pull itself out of a financial crisis with the Mustang launch. It seems the filmmakers decided that, since they had already painted Iacocca as a fool early on, they would stick to this portrayal throughout the rest of the movie. However, the film did correctly show that Lee Iacocca was the one who insisted on bringing Carroll Shelby and his racing team into the GT40 project, as he immediately saw something special in him. One of the most talented drivers on Shelby's team was Ken Miles. The storyline about Ken's financial struggles was also fictionalized to add dramatic effect. While Ken wasn't a millionaire, he had been on a decent salary with Shelby for several years and was absolutely capable of feeding his family. The same goes for the film's portrayal of Ken's supposedly awful character. Like any person, Ken had his quirks, but the idea that he would throw a wrench at Shelby or getting into ridiculous fistfights is purely a fabrication. Ken had immense respect for Carroll and would never have dreamed of attacking him. Moreover, in the real story, Ken had no reason to be excluded from the races. He was never removed from competition. Once again, this was done in the film to add more drama and give the audience a reason to sympathize with Miles. In reality, no one prevented him from racing. No matter how odd Miles may have seemed, everyone could see he was simply obsessed with winning. Day after day, week after week, he tested the GT40 at the Shelby team's base in California. A loner who often forgot to shave and didn't smell particularly good, he spent hours behind the wheel, striving for the perfect, flawless car. And he didn't just improve the car's design, he honed his own driving skills, becoming one with the car. You'd have to be an idiot to remove such a fanatic from a race. Of course, there were some idiots in Ford's management, and I'll talk about them later. But the goal was set, win at all costs, and everyone knew that with Miles behind the wheel, their chances of victory were significantly higher. The film also suggests that Miles and Shelby almost single-handedly perfected the car, with everyone else around them being completely incompetent when it came to car building. This is another exaggeration for dramatic effect.
Go ahead, Carroll. Go to war.
Thank you, sir.
The film did correctly depict that for Henry Ford II, the rivalry with Ferrari was like a real war. Ford sent in experts from Aerospace Division to assist Shelby and Miles, many of whom later went on to work on NASA's moon landing program. Maybe Miles did use tape and identify some basic aerodynamic issues with the car, but it was the NASA specialists who did all the complex technical calculations, and they were the ones who diagnosed the lack of airflow under the hood, which caused the engine to struggle to breathe and risk overheating. I think you can understand the kind of investment it took to bring in such experts, and that the approach to building this car was just as serious as designing a spacecraft. The 1966 Le Mans was more than just another race. It was the defining moment for everyone involved in the GT40 project. For Carroll Shelby, his entire partnership with Ford was on the line. The company's executives were growing skeptical about the racing program, which had devoured an enormous budget without delivering any results. If they didn't win this time, it could all be over. But there was another factor the movie didn't touch on, something that nearly ended Ford's involvement in racing before Le Mans even began. In 1965, consumer activist Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, a book that ripped into the American auto industry. He accused manufacturers of prioritizing profits over safety, producing powerful cars that contributed to rising traffic deaths. Suddenly, famous motto, "When on Sunday, sell on Monday," no longer sounded so appealing. Public pressure mounted. Did Ford, a company built on safety and reliability, really need to be spending millions on dangerous, high-speed racing? Especially in light of the controversy stirred up by Nader's book? From that moment on, it wasn't just about winning Le Mans anymore. It was about Ford's entire reputation. Before the race, corporate executives laid down strict rules for their drivers. Keep RPMs under 6,200. No unnecessary stress on the engines. Fasten seatbelts in the pits, not while flying down the Mulsanne Straight at full speed. No fighting between Ford drivers. The company didn't need an internal battle ruining its image. The race itself was depicted quite accurately in the film, aside from a few minor details. Right from the start, Miles' GT40 had a problem. The driver's door wouldn't close. Some say another Ford clipped his car at the start, while others believe Ken, in his rush to get in, didn't duck his head in time, causing the lightweight door to hit his helmet and bend slightly. For an average moviegoer, it might be hard to understand why the door didn't simply stay shut at such high speeds or why a loose door could be dangerous. But Miles, being highly knowledgeable in car mechanics, was well aware of the risks. During test runs before Le Mans, a similar incident had occurred. The door flew open at speeds well over 300 kilometers per hour, and the car immediately began lifting off the ground. Fortunately, within seconds, the wind tore the door off completely, causing the front end to slam back down onto the asphalt. At nearly 300 kilometers per hour, the fact that the car stayed on the track at all was pure luck. This was why Miles didn't take any chances. At the end of the first lap, he pulled into the pits, and after a 2-minute repair, he rejoined the race dead last. Just like in the movie, this setback only fueled Ken's competitive fire. He became determined to win at all costs. Lap after lap, as he passed the grandstands, he kept setting new records. His average speed continued to climb. 225, 227, 228 kilometers per hour. It seemed unreal, but by the end of the first hour, Miles had fought his way from last place to third, but victory was still uncertain. Ford had speed, but Ferrari had efficiency. The GT40's massive 7-liter engine guzzled nearly 40 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers, allowing it to hit speeds of over 350 kilometers per hour on the Mulsanne straight. Ferrari's 4-liter engine was slower, but it was far more fuel efficient, allowing for fewer pit stops. But then the rain came, and just like in the film, the downpour wiped out Ford's speed advantage. Most drivers backed off, knowing that one wrong move on the wet track could end in disaster. But Miles didn't back off. Even as the pit crew frantically signaled for him to slow down, he kept pushing, lapping the track in just 3 minutes and 40 seconds, only 10 seconds slower than his dry weather pace. By midnight, Miles was in the lead. Then came the most infamous moment in race. Ford executives wanted a picture-perfect finish, all 3 Fords crossing the line together. Leo Beebe ordered Miles to slow down and let Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon catch up him for the photo. Unlike what the movie suggests, Miles didn't argue much. He grumbled a little, but he followed orders, gradually slowing down and reducing his gap to Bruce McLaren by 10 seconds per lap. But there was one crucial problem. McLaren had started the race further back on the grid. In Le Mans, the winner isn't just the first across the finish line. Total race distance matters. Since McLaren had started 10 meters behind Miles when they crossed the line together, those 10 meters were added to his final time, making him the winner. To this day, there's no definitive answer. What really happened that day? Some claim Ford simply didn't realize how the rule worked, but I don't buy that, and here's why. First, Leo Beebe knew the rule. Race officials explicitly reminded him before the finish. Second, even if Shelby, Miles, and the team had misunderstood the rule, which is unlikely, they knew there could be no ties in Le Mans. If they truly believed Miles was guaranteed to win, why didn't they double-check the rules? Third, footage from the race shows McLaren accelerating slightly at the last second. Fourth, after the race, Miles himself said, "I work for Ford. If Ford tells me to drive this car into a lake, I guess I'll have to do it." Lastly, Beebe had a long-standing relationship with McLaren. They had worked together since 1963, long before Miles was even part of the program. Did Beebe think McLaren was the better choice because he was more marketable, or was it just personal bias? Whatever the reason, Miles was robbed of his rightful victory. Just 2 months later, Ken Miles was killed while testing a new GT40 prototype. Ford, meanwhile, went on to dominate Le Mans for 3 more years, proving that their racing program was worth every penny. But then, Ford's own downfall began. Henry Ford II, growing paranoid, began suspecting Lee Iacocca of plotting to take over the company. Fearing a loss of control, he forced Iacocca out. Iacocca didn't hesitate. He took his brilliant mind to Chrysler, where he rebuilt the struggling company from the ground up. Since Iacocca's departure, Ford has never been the same, and it never will be. Thank you for watching the video to the end. I hope you had a good time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You'll discover plenty of other captivating videos waiting for you there.